I always get nervous when I see my name next to Keynote. It should raise your anxiety level, not mine. Because really, you guys are the keynotes. I mean, it's been great discussion. It's been fun to listen to the ideas that are being shared, and it's actually an honor and a privilege to be here. When Julie asked me to come and talk, there was a lot of different topics that we considered, and there's two things that I want to talk about today. One is the notion of high potentials. And you may say, why high potentials? Why something around talent? And that is because more and more coaches are being asked to work with high potential populations. And I think coaches are going to be even more so asked to advise on, are these individuals that are being identified as talent really talent? Are they really individuals that are going to be moving up and onward within an organization, number one? And the second thing that I want to talk about is something that's new and exciting at Hogan, and that's around the concept of good judgment. Because I think, and as we've worked with coaches around the world, coaches continue to talk to us about judgment and decision making, and how one of the key things that they're working on with coachees is around this concept of improving decision making, and how a lot of times their standard models that are out in the market really don't address that concept, whether it be from an assessment standpoint or whether it be just in terms of the literature that's available for individuals to go and work on development planning. So those are two concepts that I'm going to merge together with you in exactly 1 hour and 12 minutes, because I also realize, as the last person of the day, I'm the only thing standing between you and a cocktail. And actually a wonderful menu. So I took a peek of that as well. So I know that's always hard, especially this time of day. To start off though, after 35 years in business, Hogan is focused on one thing, and that's research. That's what we started as back when Bob and Joyce Hogan founded the company. Both were professors at Johns Hopkins University back in Baltimore, Maryland. Both were focused on one thing. How do you predict job performance? And that's been the foundation of our company since day one. Joyce Hogan unfortunately passed away a few years ago, right up until the point where she left. She was focused on one thing: predicting job performance. And that's still what Bob does today as an active member of our organization. In doing so, it's been from entry-level positions all the way up to this new concept called high potentials. I say this concept called high potentials because that's what I want to start the conversation with you on, just by asking the question, when I say the word high potential, how do you define that? How do you define high potentials, either in your own way or in your organization's definition of what is a high potential? This would be the audience participation part. Yes?
As aspiration, do they want to succeed more? Do they want the more, senior job, more complex job? So is that also personal? What's their aspiration? What's their engagement to the company itself?
Okay.
Are they engaged and motivated to do that? And what is their past performance been like?
Okay, so aspiration, engagement, past performance, do they want to move up, higher job levels? Great.
Sorry, in that aspiration element is also do they hit capability?
Okay, so is there also potential?
Yeah.
Okay. What about others? What are other ways that either you or your organization define high potential?
Succession planning.
Succession planning.
See them with the potentials and capabilities to make it to the top.
Okay.
The senior positions.
So can you fill senior positions when they're available? Can you move up and into the succession planning pipeline, perhaps? Okay. Other unique ways people are identifying, or should I say defining high potential?
The most common
Yes.
definition that I've heard used to organizations is the term upwardly mobile, or the candidate's upwardly mobile.
Okay.
And that's sort of a case of looking at past performance and seeing, do they still have room to grow in? Have they reached the right level, or are they still got running room?
So it's kind of like the little engine that wished that it could. Has it reached its full potential, or can it give a little bit more to the organization? Can it move perhaps another level up? What's really interesting is when you look at all the definitions of high potential, and all you have to do is open up the latest talent management magazine. Follow me on Twitter. I was over there tweeting about high potentials just a minute ago because Forbes just has a new article out on decision making and high potentials. Actually, our CEO just contributed to it. Everybody's talking about high potentials. Everybody's talking about decision making. These are hot topics. Nobody has a standard definition. because it really is. It's this fuzzy thing, and I think that's one of the challenges that we face. However, what I want to do today is boil down what we feel like are 5 important themes that you probably ought to pay attention to and that your organizations ought to be aware of if we're going to talk about high potentials. There's an interesting statistic. It just came out. DDI once a year, and DDI is a global partners of ours, Development Dimensions International. Business with strong leadership, they found, this is a global study, are 13 times more likely to outperform the competition. You're all going to say, duh, Ryan. I mean, organizations with strong leadership are going to win. However, only 44% of those actually have high potential programs that are defined. Out of that, 18% of those actually say they have enough talent on the bench to meet their succession planning needs. What does that mean? That means we have a talent shortage. What they're saying is they don't have enough people in their succession pipeline, as Nina was pointing out, the succession planning process, to actually fill those gaps. That means we have a lot of development to do. We have a lot of people that we're asking to step up at a much younger stage in their career into key positions. And I'll show you a graphic shortly that says that's going to be more regional and based on where you are in the world. Asia, actually Germany is one of the countries that's leading the race in terms of a talent gap in the next several years in certain roles at certain age levels along the way. The other thing that we're finding is there's a challenge because of some failed hiring practices. Part of that's due to the fact that we're pretty bad at selecting people into organizations. And that is, it's not that we can't identify talent within, it's perhaps that we don't identify the right people in the right roles to begin with. A lot of times our hiring decisions are based on, can they fog up a mirror? As in, if they're able to show up and actually walk, talk, and chew gum at the same time, let's get them into the organization, right? And I realize also, a lot of countries here in Europe, once you're in, it's pretty hard to get rid of you as well. Is that not the case, right? Never heard of that anywhere, right? What we know is, again, this is a CCL stat, Center for Creative Leadership, 66% of senior managers hired from the outside don't necessarily make it. They don't work out. What we also know is that 48% of the high potentials that are designated as high potentials that are promoted from within also struggle within the first 18 months of their promotion. The question we ask ourselves is why? Why are these people that are identified as high potentials, why are these people that are identified as outside senior experts that are hired from the outside to fill these senior roles, why do they struggle? Our answer is poor person job fit and poor person culture fit is answer number one. Answer number two is there's probably not a good transition or onboarding plan. They're not working with a good coach to set up the factors for success that will help them integrate into an existing organization. We do a lot of work in the financial services industry. Imagine a senior executive coming from a traditional, say, rural bank where customer interaction is key to that bank's success. They're coming into a more metro, commercial financial service organization where it's very transactional, it's very prim and proper. To take that customer service focus that's made them successful in Bank A and try to do that in Bank B, it's not going to work out for them as well. They don't understand, they're lost. They have no one to turn to because their peer group now is very aggressive, they're very transactional. They're not going to feel like they fit. They're going to feel like a fish out of water, as we say. So again, having the right mechanisms to make that successful transition is going to be key to their success.
Ryan,
Yes?
question. Are those North American figures or global?
No, actually, this is a global study, again, by CCL, which is really important, I think, as we walk through this. A lot of these stats will come out of these global samples and global studies. When we did these, when we originally started doing these types of research about 4 years ago, it was more North American centric because what we found is European and Asian organizations were very reluctant to release their data. But what we found now is people are more mobile around the world. What do you know? Every organization wants a benchmark. They want to help, they want to understand how are we doing because we're having to deploy people to the Middle East, to Asia, even into North America. And we need to understand what do we have to do to help them be successful as well. One other thing that I think is very interesting, and this helps transition the conversation into a hot topic, and the topic that I think we really want to talk about is leadership. Where do you think most illness comes from? Just off the top of your head, where do you think most illness comes from? Stress. That's right. And this is a North American stat. The Center for Disease Control, which is our public health agency in the U.S., recently released a study that said 67% of health issues in the United States comes from stress. Where do 72% of the American population spend 71% of their adult life? At work. Where do we think stress comes from at work? Let me give you another stat. The Gallup organization, big survey company, they do millions of exit interviews every year for all the publicly traded companies in the United States. And Gallup did a survey. It was 100,000 working adults that were exiting their organization. And they tried to use some standardized survey questions. Some good friends of ours work there. Handed over some survey data. The 100,000 working adults, they were asked, what is the most stressful part of your job? What do you think they said? My direct supervisor. Ergo, for us, what we say is bad management, bad leadership is a public health crisis. Okay? So when we talk about leadership, there's a reason why we put so much emphasis on it. One is we're leadership nuts at Hogan. We really believe in studying about leadership. We think it's critical to success, and I'll show you a model of why leadership is critical to the success of a business. And it's not what you may think, that the leader's driving business unit results. There's a step in between. But those stats just point to one thing, and that is that leadership's critical. The challenge is the academic leadership research has failed. That is, just like you can't get people to describe hypos the same way, you can't get academics to describe successful leadership characteristics in the same way either. So what's emerged is really two traditions of the study of leadership. There's the academic research, and then there's what we call the troubadour tradition. So out of the academic literature, you get different studies that say, oh, well, successful leaders are taller than their followers. Successful leaders have a certain shoe size. Successful leaders in the 17th century were short and had multiple affairs. Things like that. I mean, it's basically trivial and useless, but you know what? It had a correlation of like 0.85. So it doesn't really tell us much. The other side of the story is the troubadour tradition. This is the rantings and ravings and musings of actually very successful business people. So books titled like Leadership Lessons of Genghis Khan, Michael Dell's Story of Dell, Welsh on Welsh. These are the interesting stories of self-made billionaires that have been very successful in their own regard, in their own circumstances, but it's based on a snapshot in time. It's a unique story. And yes, there are interesting tidbits, but they're not things that you or I can take and replicate in our own organization, right? I mean, there's no way that I can take what Michael Dell did in his dorm room in Austin, Texas, and recreate it at Philips or at Heineken. There's no way I can take that and go to APM Terminals and recreate what Jack Welch did at GE in terms of just firing, 20% of the workforce. Why not? Hey, let's do it this year. It doesn't work that way. But there are some mentality things that I can think about. So what we did is we started to say, if we can't get a good definition that we can replicate across time of good leadership, if people really can't decide on what good leadership is, perhaps we can get people to talk about bad leadership. Can we get people to describe what the worst characteristics are in leaders? Do you think we can get people to give us common definitions of what they don't like in leaders? Yeah, you bet you can. So this is a little research that we did. And so for about a month and a half, we asked people that visited us on our website, who went through any of our workshops, to log on and to give us a perspective on what they thought were the personality characteristics of the worst bosses they had ever worked for. And over the course of 90 days, we collected 15,000 responses. That's right. People were more than happy to respond to what the worst characteristics of their bosses were. And what was really interesting was that 52% of those people said the worst characteristic of their manager or boss was that they were overly arrogant. And that is, they were more than happy to take credit for what they had done, and or they thought they were always right. They were unwilling to admit mistakes. They were overly bold and brash. 50% said the worst characteristic was that they were manipulative. They played favorites. They played games. They were willing to do things outside of the lines, outside of bounds, but then found ways to, shift the blame, to shift the focus to where they weren't held accountable. 49%, it was what I call the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde phenomenon, that emotionally volatile. We work with a large equipment manufacturer based in the U.S., and we're having had an opportunity over the last 6 years to work with their EVP of sales for their global organization. The team bought him a clock that was made out of old tractor parts. It doesn't run because they never put a battery in it, but it sits outside of his office, and every day by 9 a.m., the administrative assistant puts the big hand either on 6 or 12. If it's on 6, it's basically a sign to the team that as of this morning, it's okay, you can come on in. If the big hand's on 12, it's one of those days you might want to stay away. That's called simple mood management around somebody that's emotionally volatile. As coaches, you're saying, oh my gosh, can I please sign up to help this poor gentleman's team? You're exactly right, though. But again, that's that emotional volatility. So again, you can start to categorize these things. There was a really good researcher. His name was Jack Bentz. He was the SVP of HR for Sears and Roebuck, which is a very large department store chain in the United States. Back in the late 70s, Sears had one of the best assessment centers for store managers that was ever created. It followed a lot of the assessment center methodology that actually made DDI famous out of the old AT&T work that came out of Harvard, which was tied back to the German assessment centers from the early wars. And what was very interesting about Bentz's work that he later published was it fell in line with what we found as well, that you can describe derailing characteristics of leaders and managers into about 11 or 12 buckets or characteristics. And it's characteristics that on the surface oftentimes make a leader seem and appear very engaging, very attractive. I mean, what's the opposite of being arrogant? I mean, what might we call that on a daily basis? Confident. What might we call somebody that's actually manipulative but not over-the-cliff manipulative? Influencing. Yeah. Exciting. Rule testing. Emotionally volatile. What might we call that if it's not crossing the line? Passionate. Involved. Yeah, I mean, hey, let's go, team, instead of pulling my hair out. So again, these are things that up to a point can be very well-used strengths. But there's a point in time where if a leader's not aware, if they don't have strategic self-awareness of how these potential strengths can cross that line and cause them to fall off that cliff, can become challenges that could derail an otherwise successful trajectory. So again, we want to identify these things and be able to talk about them to help someone over the course of time. I mentioned the whole idea of an aging workforce. This is a statistic, actually it's now 2 years old because they haven't updated the census out of the UN yet. The whole notion here is just simply, we do have a talent shortage looming. We have a talent shortage looming in ages 35 to 44, which is traditionally that age range that's being identified as individuals being groomed for that VP, EVP role within most organizations. And what you can simply see here is that the United States, Germany, the UK, and then on down the line, Italy, Japan, China, are the countries where we have a larger gap of individuals within that age range in the workforce. And so, the neighbors here in Germany, 27% decline in individuals that are in the workforce in that critical age group. So asking younger individuals that have less experience in the workforce, have less experience in their organization, to step into these key senior roles. The data from Japan and China is actually quite distorted. Why? Because their populations are so big. So actually, if you correct for the population distortion, China is off the chart. You have senior leaders in China that are actually in their 20s that are occupying general manager roles that normally you wouldn't see people in until they were in their 40s. So the work we're doing in China, we're having people that are having executive coaches that are truly classified as executives early as 25, 26, 27 years old. They may be 3 years out of university, something that you or I would normally not think would happen until they're in their 50s. So again, it's amazing when you think about the disparity in age and experience and what we're challenging individuals to do when we think about a high potential environment and a high potential definition. So when we think about defining leadership, one of the caveats I want to make is historically when we define leadership, we define it as what? We define it as people leadership. And we had an interesting conversation the other day with one of the organizations here in the Netherlands that leadership doesn't always have to be about people leadership. And organizations have gotten smarter, and they've defined career management. They've defined career tracks to where leadership now can be about people leadership, it could be about process or product leadership. You can take very technical people. And it's a topic that I've presented on at 2 major conferences with one of our clients, Cisco. And Cisco has got brilliant people that have come from Cambridge and MIT and Harvard and Stanford, and all with PhDs in computer science and mathematics. And Cisco had a major issue, and that was they were losing individuals that were brilliant scientists because to move forward in their organization, they only had one career track. And that was called manage people. And I don't know too many brilliant scientists with PhDs in computer mathematics and nanophysics that want to manage people. Or as we were talking about in our group, move from technical individual to coach. Unless we can, coach via script and, So what did Cisco do? They had a huge gap because they were recruiting these people, they were paying them well, but yet after about 2 to 3 years, they would leave the organization. Because to move up, you had to manage. Cisco got smart. They redefined their career paths. And now all of a sudden, you had a development program where a person could go and learn and explore what would it be like to be a people manager? Where are my skill gaps? Working with a coach to understand what would it take to move into perhaps an uncomfortable role? And what does that feel like? And so they basically gave them a trial run. What would a short mentoring process look like for a new individual within the group? Not for you? Great. We have process and product leadership roles available as well. You can continue your climb within the organization. So even though I'm talking about leadership, please don't get that confused, meaning that it just has to be about people leadership. And as you're consulting with talent programs, or if you're asked to consult with talent programs, make sure that hypos aren't always identified as just being for people leadership as well. So let's jump into leadership and talk about leadership. We define leadership in 2 ways. There's the traditional view, or what I call the HR view. Sorry just to throw that label on it, but I will. And then there's the Hogan view. The traditional HR view is what I call more the militaristic view. If I've got stripes on my collar and I've got stripes on my sleeve, then I'm the leader. I'm the person in charge. If I'm in the corner office with the biggest chair and the biggest desk, then I must be in charge. I'm the leader. So if it's defined by my position in the organization, then it must have to be evaluated by those that are above me, right? By my boss, by my supervisor. If that's the case, then the focus is on competencies that are valued by the organization. So I'm a positional leader, I'm evaluated by those above me, and I'm focused on simply performing what is on the wall. So the competencies that are on the wall that the organization says, these are the performance expectations or the KPIs that have been defined for this role. Not necessarily for Ryan, but for the role of supervisor or director or manager that are basically in the job description. We think there's some problems with that. What that does is it completely discounts the team. It completely discounts the whole notion of business unit performance, which is driven, we believe, by engagement and engagement of the team. So we'd like to propose an alternative view. We'd like to propose a view of leadership that's defined by the ability to build and maintain a high-performing team. That's the role of a leader. Full stop. Being able to build and maintain a high-performing team. And if you take that view, then what you can do is you can evaluate it in terms of the performance of the team. Not the performance of the individual leader against a series of criteria that oftentimes were randomly set by a group of individuals in a windowless conference room, but rather by how does the team perform against those with whom they compete. And then we can focus on the qualities that are valued by the team. And you know what? One team that operates in, say, Asia versus South America may have slightly different values and qualities that they need out of a leader than the other group because of the business circumstance, because of the market, because of the environment, or because of the timing in the business unit's life. So what we feel like is if you do these things, it helps clarify the meaning and purpose of leadership. It helps us further define what bad leadership is, because the team will tell you this just isn't working out. And then finally, it gives us a clear model to help evaluate a leader's performance. You know, Eisenhower, the American president, once said, you know, once you're not president, they stop laughing at your jokes. Well, that was because it was the top-down approach. My line to Ike would have been, well, again, if you had the trust and you had the admiration of your team, they're going to laugh at your jokes whether or not you're president or not. And it doesn't matter if they're funny either. So again, it's about leadership here. It's really interesting. People say, well, where did you come up with that view? What's the theoretical aspects of that? You know, Bob Hogan's been looking at it from a socioanalytic perspective and an evolutionary theory perspective for a number of years. And so we go back to more of an evolutionary view. And it's simple like this. We all evolved as group living animals, you know, and as you go back to the prehistoric days of mankind, what do? We all lived as basically tribes, right? And so you go back to the days when you were on this side of the valley and our tribe was over on this side of the valley, and we were farmers. And what happened was, you know, when my land dried up, we looked over the valley and we said, oh, you know, we like your valley a little bit better. You've got better water. You've got better farming supply. You've got better looking animals. And over here, you were just doing your thing. You had some people that hunt. You had some people that fish. You had some people that cooked. You had some lazy people that just laid out by the river and worked on their tan. But when we came, we didn't come to negotiate. We came because of warfare, right? And what it took was somebody in the tribe who could rally the troops to defend themselves. That's the history of humankind. It's warfare. Nobody likes to talk about it, but it's true. And so being able to build and maintain that highly effective team for a set period of time is what has driven human evolution. And I think that's a key characteristic in an organization. That's what gives leaders the flexibility along the way. This is what we call the value chain model. And that is a leader's personality impacts the organization and the team in three distinct ways. And that is a leader's personality drives behavior. Behavior impacts the organization or the team in terms of structure and consideration. Oops. And so you think about it, and the classic example that I use is, and this is more North American centric, but when I go to the airport, I've got several options to fly out of where I live. I don't get on American Airlines. There's a reason, because when you get on board, and you could probably equate this to any European carrier, when I get on board, it's sit down, shut up, and put your bag in the locker. That's it. And that is disengaged employees. Well, somebody at the leadership level, their personality is driving behavior. Their behavior around structure and consideration of their team, around their staff, is driving the trust the staff has around management at American Airlines. And there's been many articles published about the current merger between American and U.S. Airways in the U.S. and how it has destroyed engagement in that organization. And that lack of engagement of their staff, whether it be the baggage handlers, whether it be the air crew, whether it be the reservation desk, has driven business unit performance down. And as a consumer, I see that directly. I take that in comparison to Southwest Airlines, which is one of our discount air carriers, which now has grown into actually one of the major carriers in the U.S. You get on board, they're smiling, they sing their safety announcement to you. It's kind of fun. Every once in a while you run into a cranky person. But in general, when you're getting on Southwest, you're not going to run into somebody that just is not going to be friendly and helpful. Why? Because they purposely have leadership that exhibits the proper behavior, structure, and consideration. They have the trust of their team. Their employees are engaged. Engagement drives their business unit performance. And you have customers that won't fly any other airline. If Southwest doesn't go there, they don't need to go there either, is what their customers will tell you. Same thing with personality and values. Values in organizations differ. Values in organizations are around rewards and sanctions, the type of culture you create. We punish certain things, we value certain things. That creates the culture in the organization, that drives engagement as well. Some people will tell you they can work for Microsoft, some people will tell you they can work for IBM. IBMers will say, I could never work for Microsoft. Microsoft people might say, or IBMers might say, I could work here, I couldn't work there, or the other way around. It really is an individual difference, but that's going to drive engagement and business unit performance as well. But it's the culture that the leader and the leadership creates within the organization. Personality also drives judgment, and we'll talk about that more in detail, but it drives judgment around our pre- and post-decision-making biases and our coachability. So our personality around our defensiveness and our receptiveness to feedback is directly impacted by our personality, typically around strategy and staffing. Did we make the right decisions? And then second, are we making the right judgment calls around who's on the bus? Do we have the right people in the right roles at the right time? So our teams evaluate our decision-making capabilities. Do they believe that we have the right decision-making capabilities? Are they engaged because of that? Again, all driving business unit performance. So in a causal model, personality does of the leader impact business unit performance, but it's through the engagement of their team through these different pathways. Psychologists for years have studied the behavioral aspect. Sociologists have studied the values, and the business school world has typically studied the judgment and decision making. What we'd argue is you need to put all three together to get a really good view of how that impacts engagement and how that ultimately drives the business unit performance. Yes, sir?
I would challenge that value chain.
Okay.
I would say that values drive personality and not the other way around.
Okay.
So I don't think a leader with his or her own personality can drive the values in an organization necessarily. A leader with the right set of values can amplify the values of the organization, but not necessarily change them.
I think what we've got is just the way we define values. So for us, personality or who you are, both your day-to-day characteristics and also your values and drivers, your own personal values and drivers, impact the way that you will lead and direct and what you will punish and reward on your own team. That will have a direct impact on what you support in terms of the organization's values and drivers. So the classic example is in a say regional sales organization. You may value certain things on your sales team that the other regions do not. You're not willing to enforce certain policies, procedures, but all the other regions do. Therefore, your team is different, treated different, feels different. That's going to either drive or hinder engagement as an overall sales group. It's based on your own values and drivers. The other thing that we see is by staffing, by changing who we bring into the team, that's how we change a corporate culture. So really, it comes down to the level of how we're defining my personal values versus the values of an organization. So I can't say I disagree with you. I think it's just how what we're defining as the values or the culture within the organization.
And it's also a bit of a trick in building the values within a team to become a high-performance team, which I can agree. But you cannot isolate teams from the over the organization.
No.
And then when a team operates according to a different set of values, can still be successful for some time.
That's right.
But we will definitely be kicked out of the organization in the medium long term.
And oftentimes what you'll find is there's maybe one or two shared values, but then they operate under their own. And still notion of culture versus climate. What's the culture of the organization versus what's the climate within the team? And you find those get ferreted out over the course of time. So as we talk about defining the next level of leadership, what are some key points, or what are 5 key points that I hope you can use as takeaways around high potentials? The first is you've got to define potential correctly. And it's the old 80-20 rule. And that is that, 20% of your workforce is accounting for 80% of the work. It's the traditional law that is there. What we know is that good leaders communicate effectively. They make sound decisions. They take responsibility for their mistakes. They respect others and establish a vision. Unfortunately, the current practice within most high potential programs are focusing on who the person knows. That is, it's a political decision. They're still made by peer nominations or by supervisor nominations. What we see is that most programs lack objectivity, and there's a lack of multiple perspectives on an individual's performance and or opportunities or measures of potential for future progression. We also believe that high potentials in terms of defining potential, you have to find the potential in terms of people that are rewarding to deal with, as in other people will interact with them, that they're talented and they're going to learn tasks quickly because they do have a lot to learn as high potentials, and they do take initiative. Because being a high potential is not in the future going to be, here, let me hold your hand and walk you through this program, but rather you still have a job to do. As it was mentioned, there's a million things going on. It's 11 o'clock. I'm still sending out emails. When am I going to have time to have a coaching conversation? Much less work on all of the things that are assigned to me as part of my high potential development.
And another point is that not higher performers are not always.
Thank you.
That's a common mistake.
Thank you for that. Only about 30% of your high performers are actually high potentials. And that was actually a statistic that was recently released as part of DDI's global assessment survey as well. And that's really point number 2 is you have to identify your talented employees, and this is where you have to be cautious, and that is just because they're talented high performers doesn't mean they're high potentials. And that's one of the hardest messages to deliver. How many of you in your organization right now actually publicly identify your high potentials? So do your high potentials actually know who they are? Or do you have debate within your organization over do you identify them and tell them or not?
We're in the midst of making it more visible.
More visible.
And there is resistance all over the place.
Okay.
That's funny, because I come from the other way around. We were very transparent, people that never said they were high potential or top potential, and being responsible for that for 4 years, I have completely come back from that. I think you should identify them, but where I'm now, I would not say, this is the sticker on your hat, because you can't get it up anymore. At least that's the experience in our culture.
Yeah.
So I've switched really, in my opinion, how to deal with high performance and high potential.
I think the challenge becomes simply what do you do with those that are high performers that aren't designated as high potentials? Because you run 2 risks. One is that they become disengaged, and so you have the opportunity in front of you of retention. How do I retain a high performer that says, well, I'm not a high potential here, I could go to a competitor because obviously I'm a high performer. Second, how do you create ongoing development that continues to potentially grow their skills within their current role or maybe 1 or 2 steps up, but knowing that they're never going to take that 3 or 4 steps up if that's how much scaling you still have left in your organization. And I think that's an ongoing discussion. There's a really good article which I'll make sure that Julie sends to everybody along with the slide deck and some other things by by Alan Church and Rob Silver. Alan Church is the EVP of talent at PepsiCo. And not only is he still actively involved in PepsiCo International, he's an author, he's also an active psychologist within the Society of Industrial Organizational Psychology that I belong to. He published an article on his lessons learned running PepsiCo's top talent programs for the last 3 or 4 years. And it's really interesting, the discussion that they have back and forth about, do you identify talent or not? So what's really interesting, I think, about identifying the talented employees, what do most people do now? Again, it's supervisor nominated. What they find is they alienate those that are already hypos or that are really hypos that aren't nominated because they may be working for someone who, number one, is somewhat envious of the fact that their name's even on the list because they themselves have been passed over. Or we've even seen cases where they're so valuable to their current manager that they won't let them go because what are they going to do in terms of backfilling on their team? And then the third thing is, by doing this, we hear a lot of organizations say it's inhibiting the group's performance because there's so much energy and time spent around this process, they forget about their day job. And because organizations aren't backfilling, what's happening to the actual work that has to be done to drive performance across the organization? What we would say is there's 5 things that people should be looking for in identifying these hypos. Number one, as I mentioned before, they have to be rewarding to deal with. And when we talk about Hogan language, for those of you who may be familiar, this is a function of adjustment and sociability. It's a function of hedonism. It's a function of somewhat being colorful, but not to an extreme. It's a function of being talented. So you got to have some inquisitiveness. You have to have some learning approach, some imagination or imaginative. You have to have lower scores on what we call tradition and security. So you have to be willing to step out, take some risks. You have to actually be willing to push the envelope and have a global mindset. You also have to be productive, drive for results, hardworking. That comes from things like being prudent, having some learning approach, being ambitious. You also have to have some power, being willing to step up and be a leader, as well as driving for commercial results. Leader-like, it's called a high potential. And so whether it be in people leadership, process, or product leadership, being willing to step up and take charge of something. Be also at a good judgment. And this is where the judgment assessment actually comes into play. And then there's also a sense of entrepreneurship. And this is that creativeness, that innovation. Being willing to test the assumptions, being able to test the limits. It may not be actually implementation, but at least being willing to think about why do we do the things we do. Challenging assumptions, challenging the status quo. So having some of that curiosity that we find with things like, again, inquisitiveness, being somewhat bold, being somewhat imaginative. What we also find in the survey results is that other employees are paying attention to who is nominated. And so their support of your hypos is more and more critical because they're asked to backfill. They're asked to pick up, in essence, what we call the slack or the extra assignments along the way. If they don't feel like you're nominating and you're pulling the right people off the playing field, why would they step up and take on extra duties if they don't feel like the future leaders of the organization are the right people to begin with? Point number 3, you've got to use objective measures. We feel like you need to take a multidimensional approach to your evaluation process. You need to look at their work habits, so that's past work history. You also, though, have to trust your data. You know how many times we sit in clients' offices and they say, past work history, past performance data. They laugh at their own metrics. And that's actually something that really, from an evaluative perspective, you've got to have good internal data. What sometimes that means is separating data used for administrative decisions, like yearly performance reviews for pay increases, from your talent pool data and doing that separately. And that way it doesn't matter if everybody's got 4s and 5s, which justifies their existence in the organization. We actually have separate talent review data that we use to make strategy and staffing decisions on.